Hello everyone. In this topic, let us understand about Azure Queues, Azure Tables, and Azure Disks. Azure Queue service is used to store large number of messages, and these queue storage, whatever we are going to create using the Azure Storage, it can be accessed via the HTTP or HTTPS. A queue can contain millions of messages. We create the queue, it can store millions of messages. A message can be of 64 KB. So each messages are broken into 64 KB chunks. So this is the queue storage. So whenever you want to integrate your application with asynchronous type of request, then you use queue storage. So queues are commonly used to create a backlog of work to process asynchronously. If I wanted to give an example for the Azure Queue Storage, I will give a simple example. Let me take an application. We call this as banking application, where multiple users are submitting their application form. So this is the application form which the users are going to fill: their name, their date of birth, and address. So all these users wanted to create an account using this application form in this bank. Say this bank is XYZ. So I use this application form to fill and submit to the bank. So once the user submits the application form, it has to go through certain process. We have integrated our queue storage in this application. This is my queue storage. Whatever application which has been submitted by the users, it will stay in the queue storage. These application form are broken into 64 KB chunks. These are the messages which are stored in the queue storage. Once the messages are stored in the queue storage, the user who has sent the application or the user who has submitted the application has to get notified. For that, I will integrate with another service which is called function. This function has to trigger a notification and send it to the user who has submitted the application form. So this way we can integrate the queue storage for different application architecture. This is one of the simplest example which I have given for the banking application. So what are Azure Tables? Azure Table is a NoSQL database. This is a structured database which doesn't have any schema. So it doesn't have any schema, and we know that this is a NoSQL database. It can store large amounts of structured data. So when you create Azure Tables under storage account, we can store massive amount of structured data. These data is non-relational data. So unlike the relational database, Azure Tables doesn't use rows and columns to store the data, and it doesn't have the proper schema. In the earlier days, when we started using the Azure Cloud, we used to create the storage account. Then we create the blob storage. Under the blob storage, we add an option to create page blobs. So this is very confusing term because the virtual machine which you are going to create, it requires the block storage. This is the block storage which is required to create the operating system or to store the data. So operating system disk and the data disk is a block storage in virtual machine, and we need to create the page blob as the blob type which can be attached to the virtual machine as the operating system disk or the data disk. Since now we are using the managed disks, there is no need for us to create the storage account. There is no need for us to create the blob storage and then use the page blobs. We simply create the virtual machine and use the managed disks. So we assign the managed disks for the operating system and for storing the data. So we create the data disk for storing the data, and to run the operating system, we use the operating system disk. By default, the operating system disk will be 128 GB. Azure will take care of this managed disks. These managed disks are locally redundant, or it is zone redundant. So this was the overview of Azure Queues, Azure Tables, and Azure Blobs. Thank you for watching the video. If you like the content, please subscribe and share the video. Thank you and take care.